Improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Tonight, we're not talking about tanks crossing a border. We're not talking about missiles screaming across the sky. We are not talking about any of that. No, we're actually talking about something quieter, something colder, something most Americans will never see coming because it is happening hundreds of miles above their heads. Russia is operationalizing co-orbital anti-satellite weapons. Now that sounds like Pentagon wallpaper, so let me translate that. They are putting things in space that can maneuver close to our satellites, shadow them, inspect them, stalk them, and then potentially kill them. And that's not a theory. This is not some movie or a think tank paper. This is happening right now in orbit. And that matters because a modern war does not begin when the first bomb drops. It begins when the lights go out, when GPS gets unreliable, when comms get dirty, when targeting data disappears, or financial systems hiccup, when a commander on the ground can't see, when ships, aircraft, drones, missiles, and troops suddenly become less connected, much less precise, more blind. That is the battlefield Russia is probing right now, space. And I've talked about this, not as a science project, but as terrain. And here's the uncomfortable part. The United States built the most connected, satellite-dependent military machine in human history. That gave us dominance, speed, precision, and global reach. But every strength casts a shadow. And our satellites are the nervous system of the American way of war. Now, Russia knows that. China knows that. Even Iran knows that. Every serious adversary knows that if you cannot beat the body head on, you attack the nerves. You don't have to sink the carrier if you can blind it. You don't have to defeat the brigade if you can break its timing. You don't have to match America platform for platform if you can sever the architecture that makes those platforms lethal. And that is the new game. And it is not clean. It is not cinematic. It's not going to look like a Hollywood space battle. It's going to look like ambiguity. Satellite drifts too close, a system's malfunction, a sensor goes dark, or a constellation degrades. Nobody knows if it was an accident, a test, a warning, or an attack. And that ambiguity is the weapon, because if you can create doubt below the threshold of war, you can put pressure on an enemy without triggering the full weight of their response. That is gray zone warfare in orbit. And Russia has been living in that gray space for a very long time, whether it's cyber, whether it's disinformation, energy leverage, proxy pressure, political coercion. Now add orbital stalking to the list. Here's the bigger implication. The next major war may not start with a mushroom cloud, an invasion, or a carrier strike group moving into position. It may start with silence. No signal, no feed, no positioning, no certainty, just commanders staring at screens that no longer tell the truth. And if you're waiting for someone to announce World War III has begun, you're already behind the curve, because the first shots may be invisible. The first casualties may actually be machines. The first objective may be to blind the decision makers before they even know they're under attack. And that's where we are right now. Russia is not just preparing to fight on the ground in Ukraine. It is preparing to contest the systems that make American power global. Space is no longer sanctuary. It is no longer neutral. It is no longer untouchable. It is now contested battle space. And anyone telling you otherwise is selling yesterday's map to tomorrow's war. So tonight we're going to break down what Russia is doing, why co-orbital ASAT weapons matter, how this changes deterrence, and what it means for the United States, NATO, and every civilian who assumes the modern world will keep working because it always has. That assumption is dead. The new fight is above us. It's quiet, it's patient, it's orbital, and if we don't harden, disperse, replace, and defend the systems we depend on, we're not preparing for the next war. We are volunteering to be blinded in it, and that's how it is. Welcome to the Carry On podcast, SITREP edition for the week of May the 1st. No, this is not the new schedule for the show to drop on Mondays, but it will be for the next several weeks due to scheduling issues for the team. Just know that even though this is being heard Monday, we are discussing the preceding week. If it helps, have a drink. I assure you it'll make things much clearer. I would like to take a moment and recognize our newest Patreon member, Craig. Thank you, sir, for helping this show grow and continue to share stories with you. Now, aside from Russia finding an eye patch and a cat and turning into a Bond villain in space, this evening I want to talk about the War Powers Act and a bit of technology that I can't believe the Marine Corps is fielding. A paraglider. Yeah. And that will kind of be the only items for this evening because the story about the War Powers Act is a deep cut. And it's important to understand as we move forward, not just in this current conflict with Iran, but a post-Iranian conflict environment as well. In addition to that story being a deep dive, it is also departing from my normal rule of just the facts, ma'am, style of reporting and offering some opinions mixed in. Now, relax, all my critical thinkers out there. It is 92.6% fact. I really do my best to avoid this because often we tend to treat opinions as facts when they align with our preconceived views. However, in this case, I feel that some editorializing will give the story some character. And as Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, your opinion of the world is also a confession of your character. So, let's look at the War Powers Act. Now, there has been a lot of reporting recently on the War Powers Act and the responsibilities of the president and Congress in waging hostilities on foreign powers. It's something that I wanted to understand more of, and I want to share that with you as well. You're welcome. So the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was Congress trying to put a leash back on presidential war making after Vietnam, after Cambodia, and really decades of executive drift. Now, the law was supposed to force the president to consult Congress, report military action within 48 hours, and end unauthorized hostilities after 60 days unless Congress approved the operation. Now, on paper, that sounds like a break. In practice, presidents have turned it into a ritual. Notify carefully, avoid trigger language, redefine hostilities, then claim Article 2 authority, stretch old authorizations, hide inside coalition missions, and dare Congress to stop them. The War Powers Resolution did not fail because presidents are clever. It failed because Congress built a mechanism that depends on political courage, then spent 50 years proving it rarely has any. And that is that little percentage of opinion I just sprinkled in there. But hold on, there's going to be more. I'm not going to warn you every time. Let's talk about some background on this War Powers Resolution. So as I said, it was passed in 1973 over President Nixon's veto, by the way. It came out of the absolute wreckage of Vietnam and the secret bombing of Cambodia. Congress at the time watched the executive branch expand war by stealth, escalation, and a lot of legal fog. Now, the statute was meant to restore balance. Its core was simple. The President of the United States may introduce our forces into hostilities only when, number one, Congress declares war, or Congress gives specific statutory authorization, or the United States, its territory, possessions, or armed forces are attacked, creating a national emergency. Now, once U.S. forces enter hostilities, the president is supposedly required to notify Congress within 48 hours. Then the clock starts. From that point forward, he has, or she, 60 days. After that, the president must terminate the use of force unless and until Congress authorizes it by either declaring war, extending the deadline, or is physically unable to meet because of an attack on the United States. Now, there is a narrow 30-day extension for safe withdrawal. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the statute. That is the theory. The problem is this law never clearly defines the one word everything depends on: hostilities. That omission became the master key, and every administration since has learned to pick that lock. The main loophole is not a technicality, it is ambiguity weaponized. If the president can decide that an operation is not hostilities, then the War Powers Act clock may never start. So administrations describe military actions as something else. For example, peacekeeping, humanitarian relief, coalition support, deterrence, force protection, maritime security, interdiction, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, law enforcement. Now, stop me if any of these sound familiar, by the way. I'm not done. We also have heard ceasefire enforcement or limited defensive action. All different labels, same steel underneath. There's a historical pattern here. Let's talk about it. I'm drawing precedent. Let's go back to Vietnam and Cambodia. The War Powers Resolution was born because Congress had been cut out. Vietnam became a long executive war. Cambodia exposed how far the executive branch would go when secrecy and operational momentum replaced democratic consent. Congress, they reacted late, but it did react. The War Powers Resolution was really the institutional scar tissue. Its main purpose was to prevent another slow motion war built through escalation, secrecy, and a lot of presidential momentum. But Congress made a mistake. It wrote a law that required Congress to defend itself. That was the flaw. Let's look at the instances in our past that this War Powers Act was used and abused, and some lessons learned from each one. Mayaguez, 1975. Now, that incident was one of the earliest tests of the War Powers Act. You had the Khmer Rouge, or Khmer Rouge, I've heard it both ways. They seize a U.S. merchant ship. At the time, President Ford used military force. Operation ended very quickly, if you know anything about that one. And it became one of the rare cases where the War Powers clock was clearly implicated, but it really didn't matter because the fight was essentially over by the time the machinery engaged. What are the lessons learned from that one? Move fast, finish fast, and then report later. Congress became, and in that instant becomes, a spectator with a transcript. Okay, let's go to Lebanon, 1982 to 1984. Peacekeeping becomes combat when President Reagan sends Marines into Lebanon as part of a multinational peacekeeping force. The word, peacekeeping, it did a lot of legal work. But the Marines were not standing in a seminar room. They were sitting inside a collapsing civil war. United States positions came under attack. The mission moved from symbolic presence to very real exposure. Congress eventually recognized that U.S. forces were in hostilities and passed a specific authorization. But again, it was late. What's the lesson there? Well, you call it peacekeeping until incoming fire makes the label ridiculous. By then, the troops are already there. Let's go to Grenada, 1983. Very short war, no real constraint. Grenada showed another method: execute quickly. You frame the operation around protecting American citizens and regional stability. Finish before Congress can organize. The invasion was combat, but the legal and political fight never caught up with the tempo of the operation. Lesson learned there? Well, a short war can outrun the statute. Let's go to Central America, the proxy war, just below the threshold. The Reagan years in Central America showed a deeper technique. Do not send large visible formations if you can avoid it. You will use advisors instead, or intelligence, or money. Partner forces is even better. Use covert channels, a lot of deniability. The War Powers Resolution was designed around U.S. forces entering hostilities. It was never built well enough to control an indirect war. So the executive branch learned to operate below the threshold. Not no war, just war with fewer fingerprints. Panama, 1989. Popularity beats process. The invasion of Panama under President George Herbert Walker Bush was another unilateral use of force. Congress didn't stop it. Why? Well, because the operation was fast, the target was politically isolated, and the public justification was clean enough. You remove Noriega, protect Americans, restore democracy, and you fight drugs. Who doesn't like that? Once again, operational success dulled constitutional scrutiny. By the way, they surrounded his palace with vehicles and played at extraordinary volumes heavy metal music, which I think come to find out was Def Leppard, not what I would categorize as heavy metal music. They played it outside of his palace for days on end until he finally couldn't take it anymore and gave up. Lesson learned there, aside from Def Leppard, if the mission is popular enough, process becomes background noise. Let's go to Iraq. Not just the 91, but the 2002 as well. Authorization is infrastructure. Iraq is different in this case because Congress did authorize force, but those authorizations created another problem. Broad permissions became permanent legal infrastructure. Congress thinks it is authorizing just one conflict. The executive branch, though, treats that authorization like a forward operating base. The 91 and 02 Iraq authorizations gave presidents legal tools that could be stretched, repurposed, and nested into later operations. That is the authorization for use of force trap. Give the executive a broad enough key and it will keep finding doors. Somalia, 1992 through 1994, humanitarian mission creep. So Somalia, shit show, started as humanitarian relief. You wanted to secure aid and stabilize conditions. You wanted to protect relief operations. Then the mission totally shifts. Security, nation building, clan disarmament, targeted operations, a lot of urban combat, and a lot of American casualties. That is how mission creep works. It doesn't announce itself. It evolves in briefings. It hides in revised objectives. It grows one limited expansion at a time. By the time Congress woke up, the mission had already mutated. The lesson learned there, humanitarian entry can become combat if nobody owns the endpoint. I hope you're keeping score on these because there's going to be a test at the end. Haiti, 1994, you have an oversight without ownership. Haiti showed Congress trying to preserve ambiguity. So Congress wanted reports. They wanted objectives, a lot of rules of engagement. They wanted cost estimates. They wanted duration estimates. Sounds like Iran 2026, but it also avoided fully approving or disapproving the operation. That is congressional cowardice in its purest bureaucratic form. Oversight without ownership. Criticism without a lot of consequences. It was a political class trying to keep its fingerprints off both of the missions and the failures. And presidents love that. Kosovo, 1999. The 60-day line gets crossed. Kosovo was a major stress test. Clinton conducted NATO air operations against Yugoslavia without explicit congressional authorization. Congress did not declare war. It did not clearly authorize the campaign, but yet it funded the operation. The executive branch used that opening. The argument became, if Congress funds the mission, then surely Congress has functionally accepted the mission. And that's very dangerous because congressional members vote to fund troops in the field so they don't abandon them. Then the executive branch treats that funding as permission for the war itself. It's a casus belli, if you will. Support for the troops becomes support for the campaign. And that's how logistics get converted into consent. Let's try this one. Afghanistan and the 2001 authorization for military force. The endless authorization. After 9/11, Congress passes the 2001 authorization for use of military force. And that authorization became the legal foundation for operations against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and later associated forces. By the way, little known fact, I cannot hear the word Taliban without twisting that in my head to South Park and Towley when he says, the boys tell him, I don't want you around. And he says, oh, has there been a Towley ban? And it's dumb. And it's stuck in my head and it lives rent free and I'll never get rid of it. Oh, in addition to al-Qaeda, the aforementioned Towley ban and later associated forces. Now, those two words, associated forces, they became a legal tunnel system. See, the enemy changed, the geography changed, and the timelines changed. The whole mission changed. But the authorization stays completely alive, and that is the zombie authorization for military force problem. Congress writes broad war authority in a moment of national trauma and then refuses to revise it, narrow it, or repeal it once the battlefield changes. The result is endless legal fuel for endless conflict. Let's go to Libya, 2001. We dropped bombs without any hostilities. Libya is the modern case study in this one. The Obama administration joined NATO operations against Gaddafi's forces. United States aircraft, U.S. drones, our intelligence, our refueling, our logistics, and a boatload of targeting support were all central to the success of that campaign. But the administration argued, U.S. involvement does not constitute hostilities under the War Powers Resolution. Why? Well, there's no sustained ground combat. There's no major U.S. casualties, limited exposure. It's all coalition. It's all coalition framework. It's all remote operations. It's somewhere over there. That was the evolution. Because if American pilots or drones or our missiles, our refueling platforms, and all of our intelligence systems are enabling combat, but not a single American troop is bleeding in large numbers, well, then the executive branch can claim that the war powers clock doesn't apply. That's not restraint. That is legal camouflage built for the age of standoff war. What about this? ISIS. Old authorization, new enemy. The campaign against ISIS stretched the 2001 and 2002 authorizations even further. ISIS was not al-Qaeda in the original 9/11 sense. In fact, ISIS and al-Qaeda became enemies. But old authorizations were still used to justify new campaigns. That's strategic recycling. And it is a warning. If Congress does not sunset these authorizations, presidents will keep using them. Power doesn't sit on the shelf. Yemen, 2015 to 2019, Congress acts and then it gets vetoed. This is an interesting one. Yemen is one of the rare cases where Congress actually tried to use the war powers process. The United States was supporting the Saudi-led campaign through a lot of intelligence, logistics, arms support, and operational assistance. Now, Congress passed a resolution to end all U.S. involvement. President Trump vetoed it. Congress could not override the veto. That exposed the post-Chuda reality, which is a landmark case about veto powers that the Supreme Court ruled on a while back. And in that post-veto reality, Congress can object, but unless it has a veto-proof coalition, which it didn't, the president can often keep moving, which he did. The president can start an operation with one order. Congress may need a supermajority to stop it. That's not balanced. That's a rigged weight class. Iran, 2020 and beyond. What I call eminence and classified justification. The Soleimani strike brought the Iran war powers fight back into the center ring. The executive branch argument leaned on imminent threats and a lot of force protection, but that is a powerful terrain for the president because much of the evidence is classified. Congress is stuck arguing in public against intelligence it may not fully see, cannot fully disclose, or cannot disprove of in time. So the executive says, well, we had to act now. And then Congress responds by saying, based on what? And the president says, trust us. That is not democratic war making. That is classified momentum. The current Iran dispute, this whole ceasefire as a clock stopper. Right now, the current administration's latest move is even cleaner, and I would argue more dangerous. I caution you about opinions being slipped into this one. The argument here is that hostilities with Iran were terminated or paused because a ceasefire took effect before the war powers deadline. Translation? Yes. Force was used. Yes. The clock may have started, but the shooting paused. So that's a timeout. That's where we have the clock stopped. That's a serious expansion of executive flexibility. The statute does not clearly contain a pause button. It says terminate unauthorized force after 60 days unless Congress authorizes it. Now, a ceasefire may stop firing, but it does not automatically end the conflict if U.S. forces remain postured, armed, deployed, enforcing terms, protecting shipping, preparing to strike, or just maintaining coercive pressure. This creates a very repeatable model. Strike, then pause, call hostilities terminated, but keep everybody in play, keep everyone on the field, resume the pressure, avoid authorization. That right there turns the war powers resolution from a deadline into a suggestion. Across 50 years of doing this, the pattern is obvious. First, you avoid the word hostilities. If the operation is not legally called hostilities, the clock does not clearly start. Report consistent with the resolution. Presidents notify Congress without conceding that the statute has been triggered, and that gives the appearance of compliance while preserving executive control. Number 3, move fast. Short operations outrun congressional oversight. By the time the lawmakers organize, the battlefield facts are already created. Use coalition cover. NATO, UN, partner force, multinational labels, they all blur responsibility. The United States can be indispensable while claiming it is not leading the war. Use old authorizations like the 2001 and 2002 military force authorizations, legal machinery for conflicts far beyond their original purpose. Or just try converting funding into consent. If Congress funds troops in the field, well, then the executive branch may argue, hey, you've tacitly approved it. You've implicitly accepted the operation. Or try using classified threat claims. imminent force protection, sensitive intelligence. All of this puts Congress at a disadvantage. Reframe the war as law enforcement, counter-terrorism, or counter-narcotics, cartel interdiction. How about arrest support missions? All of those terms create alternate legal challenge for military force. And in this instance, you can use ceasefires and pauses. If a tactical pause can be treated as termination of hostilities, the 60-day clock becomes very easy to manipulate. Dare Congress to own the consequences? This is a big one. See, the executive branch knows full well that Congress oftentimes lacks the courage to cut funding, or withdraw, or vote against a mission once troops are forward. So the president moves first, Congress complains from the rear. What does all of this mean strategically? It means Congress is losing the war powers fight, not because it lacks constitutional authority, because it lacks discipline, grasshopper. Congress controls the funding. It's a basic tenet of our branches of government. It can authorize. It can also restrict. It can repeal AUMFs. It can force reporting. It can punish executive overreach. But all of that requires congressional members to own the consequences. And most don't have the courage to own that burden. They want television outrage without command responsibility. That is the rot. The presidency has built, because of all of this, a permanent war toolkit. Every president inherits the last president's precedent. Say that 5 times fast. And then it adds one more tool. Nixon gave the crisis. Reagan refined peacekeeping and proxy thresholds. Bush demonstrated short war momentum. Oh, it's not all about Republicans. Clinton tested coalition air war. Bush 43 received broad AUMF architecture. Obama normalized remote and coalition support below hostilities. Trump added all of the above and then sprinkled in a lot of veto power against war powers pushback and expanded unilateral strike logic. The current administration is testing ceasefire pause theory and broader Article 2 claims. I mention it because this is not partisan. This is institutional. This discussion I am having on the War Powers Act transcends my political ideology. It has got nothing to do with it. It is not whether I am left or right or middle, whether I am for or against current conflicts in Iran. That is completely tangential to my topic. What I am trying to outline is that we have a codified system of government. It works. It was written to work. It was written to evolve. And at the top of this pyramid, or at least connected to the triangle, is the Supreme Court. Between these 3 branches of government, you have balances of power. Congress's job is to balance this power, and it is not. And I feel as if I had laid out a good argument where they have failed over the last 50 years to do your job, sir. If the war in Iran has legitimate strategic goals, it should be an easy thing to do to lay those goals out to both houses of Congress and allow for a War Powers Resolution Act authority to be passed. This whole thing, again, this is not partisan. It is institutional. The office wants power. Power accumulates. Modern warfare is outrunning the 1973 law. This War Powers Resolution was written for a world where war looked like troops entering combat. Modern conflict looks different. Drones, cyber, special operations, maritime interdiction, proxy forces, intelligence support, missile strikes, partner targeting, sanctions enforcement, blockades, counter cartel strikes. Do any of these sound familiar? ceasefire enforcement, remote kinetic action. War in 2026 has more shadows than uniforms. This law that this is all based on is still asking whether the infantry crossed the line. The executive branch is already 3 domains past it. And at the end, the military pays the price because these legal games, they don't stay in Washington. They land on commanders and they land on troops. Ambiguous authority creates ambiguous missions. Are we at war? Are we deterring? Are we enforcing a ceasefire? Are we conducting law enforcement? Are we protecting shipping? Are we supporting partners? Are we preparing for the next strike? You see, when civilian leadership refuses to define the mission clearly, the military inherits the fog. Yeah, speaking from experience, bro, that affect rules of engagement. It affects escalation control. It affects operational planning, morale, legitimacy, and a lot of end state clarity. The lawyers may call it flexible. The troops call it unclear. The bottom line in all of this is the War Powers Resolution was designed to stop another Vietnam. Instead, it became a battlefield manual for executive lawyers, not because the law says nothing, but because it says just enough to be argued around. Presidents have learned where those seams are. Don't call it hostilities. Do not trigger the clock. Use old authorizations. Move under coalition cover. Call it peacekeeping. Call it humanitarian. No, call it counterterrorism. You can call it law enforcement or deterrence. You can call it ceasefire enforcement. Fund the troops, and then you could call that consent. Classify the threat. Call it necessary. Meanwhile, Congress keeps surrendering ground while pretending it is conducting oversight. And folks, that's just the truth. The president holds the tempo. The lawyers cut the wire. Congress writes letters. The military, they're the ones that carry the load. The American people get managed with language instead of levied with facts. And I love facts. The War Powers Resolution is still alive on paper, but in practice, it has been surrounded, bypassed, and bled down by 50 years of executive maneuvering. And that's the situation. That is my warning. And that is how a nation like ours drifts from constitutional war making into permanent discretionary force. Okay, couple of key caveats I want to mention so it is not completely subjective. It wasn't. I told you, 92.6% fact. Some presidential legal opinions have remained, are still classified or only partially public. Not every unilateral military action is unlawful. Emergency rescue, direct defense of U.S. forces, short duration responses can fall within legitimate Article 2 authority. Remember that. The real issue here is not whether presidents can ever act without Congress. They can. The issue is whether presidents can sustain or expand or pause or rename and resume military campaigns while Congress refuses to take responsibility. And historically, the answer's been yes. All right, I know it was heavy, and I appreciate you sticking with me. And I fully accept the fact that I did offer some opinions and conjectures in there. But the examples that I stated are all drawn from public facts and archives, and all of the facts are referenced, bibliographed. You can research them all. I am drawing the conclusions. That is the subjective portion in the last story. I have not abandoned the ASAT satellite topic entirely. What I think I would like to do is I want to gather, in retrospect, a little more information on the subject matter and report back to you next week with an expanded story on that. I did want to sort of foreshadow it in my opening discussion. It just brings up every time I think about it, brings up the opening scene of Moonraker where the shuttle is up there and it gets swallowed up by a mystical, dark, unlabeled, unnationed opposing force. Never heard from again. So that's kind of in my mind's eye what's taking place up there. There's a couple of ancillary stories I want to tie into it. So don't think I've abandoned that or forgotten. We're just, yeah. So I do want to end on the United States Marine Corps augmented parachute system. Something a little light, something to cleanse the palate. I think this one's fun. It caught my attention. It's kind of making me wish that I still had the uniform on, because things like this are just amazing and so beyond what I would have ever conceptualized for methods of insertion. But it's a great tool. Essentially, right now, the Marine Corps is developing a powered paraglider capability. They're doing this in partnership with a company called Subazimuth, and it's designed to move recon Marines and MARSOC raiders a lot farther, a lot quieter, and really cheaper than conventional aviation can in certain missions. Now, the Marine Corps is not a stranger to, high altitude, low opening, high altitude, high opening. There's a variety of parachute styles, shapes, forms. They do different things with some great standoff. So the powered paraglider is not in concept foreign to the military, but I think this is the first time that it has been worked to the point where it is going to become a program of record, a fielded tool in the toolbox, not just an off-the-shelf experiment or trial capability. And this whole thing sounds like a toy until you look at history. See, paragliders, paramotors, parafoils, all of these related low signature aerial systems, they've already been used or trained for by the military and a lot of proxy forces. Hamas actually used motorized paragliders during the October 7th attack. North Korea has reportedly trained special operations forces to use paragliders. Myanmar's junta has reportedly used paramotors as crewed bombing platforms. So none of this is unusual. The United States, a lot of partner forces have experimented with similar systems like this for reconnaissance, special operations, a lot of austere insertion. So it's not science fiction. It's not a gimmick. This is actually a fairly old military idea, just wearing a new fabric wing. See what I did there? The idea here, very simple. You get a small team into place the enemy is not expecting without dragging a large aviation signature behind it. Even if you do an offset release, you jump out at max altitude where the aircraft is, far enough away where radar's not going to pick it up. You have some pretty good standoff, but something like this gives you tremendous standoff. I mean, the implication here is much, much bigger. The Marine Corps is preparing for a fight. If you look at what this capability is designed to fill, the niche or the gap, the technology gap, the escalation ladder gap, they're preparing for a fight where helicopters are going to be too loud. So your Ospreys, your MV-22s may be too exposed. Your boats could be too predictable, and small teams still need to get inside the enemy's sensing and weapons envelope. And this is where something like this fills a pretty great niche. This is quiet access for the reconnaissance fight. It's not a replacement for helicopters. This is not some kind of Chuck Norris motorcycle flying fantasy. This is a very niche tool for a very unique problem, but narrow tools have been known to win wars when they're used correctly. And if the Marine Corps has identified a gap in how it moves small reconnaissance and special ops teams across distance without relying on large aviation packages, then good on you. This is a potential game changer. This gap matters because this future fight, especially when we talk across Indo-Pacific, it's not clean, it's not linear, and it's not forgiving. If it's island chains like coastlines, maritime choke points, drone coverage, electronic surveillance, radar nets, missile threat rings, contested airspace, all of that island stuff in that environment, the team that gets in quietly are going to matter much more than the platform that gets in loudly. So Sub-Azimuth, it's a joint venture connected to Triton Systems and Squirrel. I'm not familiar with either of the aforementioned companies, by the way. I had to look into them. It is positioned around powered paraglider and parachute systems. Marine Corps' broader requirement is to launch small teams from ships or from austere terrain or isolated positions, move them over long distances, land them where the enemy is not looking, and then let them do their job. Let them observe, let them report, let them communicate, disrupt if they need to. A lot of directed fires. It's pretty cool. It is a real story. This is not science fiction. This is happening now. The Marine Corps has moved it from experimental curiosity towards formal policy. The capability, as I mentioned, is intended for recon and MARSOC communities. Officially, the concept is to shift some air mobility down to the team level instead of requiring a full aviation package every time a small element needs to move. This gives them organic aviation lift. The original requirement envisioned a system capable of carrying a Marine plus combat equipment, launched from a Navy ship, transiting significant distances to shore. So far, there's been some public demonstrations. They've shown MARSOC-linked parafoil and paraglider concept in special operations scenarios involving electronic warfare and some counter-drone effects. There is imagery out there. There's public releases, both of which have shown APS activity in the Indo-Pacific, including Okinawa-linked training environments. That means that this is not theoretical. It is being worked on, exercised, and normalized. I should really need to talk to somebody in the program office and see if I can, I don't know, maybe test one out. This is so much fun. You know, the historical concept is there. It's not always clean. It's not always an honorable precedent. Hamas, looking at you. But there's real precedent here. There have always been militaries that, the smart ones anyways, that look for a new way to move troops through those last hard miles across the rivers, the walls, behind beaches, past checkpoints, through a lot of the air defense gaps into blind spots. If you look at historical context in World War II, the problem produced assault gliders. Remember those? German gliders hit Ibn Emel. Allied gliders went into Normandy and Market Garden. Those were not paragliders, but the logic was similar, quiet-ish insertion, surprise, landing close to the objective without needing a big runway. I mean, modern paragliders and paramotors are different, but they answer the same old question. How do you put a small force somewhere that the enemy did not plan for? The newer history, a little more uncomfortable, right? Like we talked about, Hamas did use these in the October 7th attack. It allowed them to bypass a lot of Israeli border defenses. And it's not very sophisticated aviation. It's asymmetric infiltration, I guess. Cheap machines, surprise, certainly psychological shock. I don't know because I have not found anything more than an anecdotal reporting, but North Korea reportedly training the special operations forces to infiltrate against South Korean and a lot of U.S.-linked targets. Now, that certainly fits North Koreans' playbook, using low-tech, high-risk, a lot of manpower-heavy surprise operations, but they can create a shitload of chaos behind the line if you do it. Myanmar's military reportedly used motorized paragliders, paramotors to drop bombs in its internal war. That's kind of the ugly version of this technology. I mentioned 3, but a poor man's airstrike, a cheap terror platform when helicopters or jets or drones are unavailable or just politically costly. Lebanese airborne elements have also been reported to have adopted powered paragliding for reconnaissance, raids, and special operations type tasks. So huge amount of precedent there. And now the Marine Corps. Marine Corps is refining the concept for a slightly different purpose, a more noble one, if I may. Controlled discipline, team level mobility for recon and special operation forces. I wonder what the training pipeline for this is going to be. How long is the course? Where is it held? It's got to be civilian because they don't have it internal. So different discipline, but the same target set. Nobody really should pretend this kind of came out of nowhere. I think it's absolutely going to give reconnaissance and raider teams another way into the battle space. Not always the best way. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Not always the safest way, but it is another way. I mean, helicopters, they're fast, but they're loud. An Osprey is really fast, but it has a signature. A boat, it's quiet, but now you're tied to the water and the coastlines. And you can do a parachute insertion. It has range, but you need aircraft and you need airspace. What if you don't have either one of those? So you have a powered paraglider. It sits right in the seam between all of those aforementioned options. It can move a single operator or a small team with less fuel, infrastructure, less planning, and potentially less detection risk. I don't know what the radar cross-section of one of these is, but it can't be much. And all of that matters when the mission is to do reconnaissance or sensor emplacement or target observation, which is reconnaissance, electronic warfare, maybe counter-drone, coastal surveillance, or just getting eyes on something before the larger force commits. So it's not designed to be a mass assault platform. We're not talking about sending in waves of Marines into a contested beach, hanging under fabric wings. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this is a niche tool for small, quiet, disciplined teams that need to move through the gap. APS is supporting the Marine Corps' larger shift towards a lot of distributed operations. If you're not familiar with Force Design 2030, it's out there in the open. You can read it. It's designing how the Marine Corps is going to fight in the future. And it's pushing the Corps away from being a second land army back toward maritime maneuver, back towards reconnaissance, littoral control, a lot of small units operating inside contested zones like the Marine Corps was made for. And this capability, it fits that world. It allows Marines to disperse, teams to self-position. It reduces dependency on these big platforms. It also complicates a lot of enemy defense planning. It is turning small teams that recon and MARSOC operate in into mobile sensors. And I think that last point's really key because with APS, a recon Marine and a raider, they're not just riflemen flying under a canopy. You're now a node because each one of these teams can carry optics. They carry radios, electronic warfare, counter drones, sensors, a lot of targeting equipment. You could do communications relay packages. Now the Marine is the payload. The real weapon is what he sees, what he transmits or enables. Strategic meaning, looking at it high level, I think a program like this says kind of something uncomfortable about the next war. I think it says the Marine Corps does not assume it will always have clean airspace. It doesn't assume that helicopters can always go where it's needed or, large aviation packages are going to survive inside of modern missile and drone envelopes. I think it also assumes that the enemy will always be blind. This is smart. The Corps is building options, and that's all this is. They're smaller, cheaper, harder to track. They're easier to disperse. I think this is the war fighter telling the institution we need lighter, quieter, stranger maybe, or get killed. I think that this is one answer. It is not the answer. It is one answer. History has shown that. Weak actors use paraglider type systems to bypass strong defenses, as we've shown. We've seen authoritarian regimes use them as cheap attack platforms, but special operations forces, they use them to explore a lot of quiet infiltration. Conventional militaries study them when the battlefield punishes large signatures. So the machine may change, the mission does not. I think modern warfare is becoming a contest of signatures because really right now everything emits, everything is watched, everything that moves, as we're seeing in Ukraine, can be found, tracked, and killed if it gets lazy. A powered paraglider doesn't make a Marine invisible, but it gives them an edge. It is slow, however. It is weather sensitive. It is very vulnerable if detected. It is going to demand a boatload of skill and discipline and the right conditions. But if all those are met, it lowers the signature enough to create options, and options are life. The force that has more ways to move, hide, sense, and strike has more ways to survive. And I think that's why the Marine Corps is interested. Not because paragliders are sexy, but because I think the future battlefield is going to punish laziness and noise and mass and predictability. And we are seeing that in real time in Ukraine. There's historical lessons. Hamas showed that paragliders, not that they are powerful, because they're not. The lesson is that perimeter defenses fail when they become predictable. North Korea, the lesson is not that paragliders are elite aviation, because they're not. The lesson is that hostile forces were trained for weird approaches if the obvious approaches are blocked. The lesson from Myanmar is not that paramotors are precision air power, because they're not. The lesson there is that cheap flying systems are dangerous when used against undefended, poorly protected, or civilian targets. And if you go back to World War II, the lesson from there is that assault gliders, it's not that the old methods return unchanged. It's that military planners keep returning to the same problem, which is, how do you put men and equipment somewhere the enemy does not expect at the time the enemy is least ready? And that's the inheritance. The Corps is not inventing the desire for silent insertion. It's, kind of updating it for the drone age. There's risks. This has real limitations. As I said, weather can shut this down. Wind can turn the mission into a recovery problem. A slow airborne Marine is vulnerable to drones, certainly small arms, radar, possibly. Again, I don't know what the cross-section is. Thermal, yes. And then plain old visual detection, although I would imagine this would be done completely at night under nods. But night operations do increase complexity. The ship launches is going to be interesting. There's a safety and a coordination problem there, because you have range. The training pipeline has got to be demanding. And then there's a real risk of mishap here with death. So the commanders may overestimate the capability because it looks bold. The last one is very dangerous. A tool like this attracts a lot of myths too, and the image is powerful. You know, Raider in the sky, recon Marine slipping over the coast. It kind of makes you look like it's the future. It looks like courage, and that's great, but physics doesn't care about marketing, and the enemy doesn't care about recruiting videos, and weather doesn't care how elite the operator is. But I think if you use this right, it gives you reach, and if you use it wrong, it gives the enemy a very slow target. And speaking of enemy, because there is going to be a cycle here, our adversaries will adapt. I would expect a lot more focus on low altitude detection, radar, acoustic sensors, drone patrols. Expect a lot more thermal imaging and counter infiltration nets around islands, ports, airfields, or any maritime checkpoints. I think once the enemy knows that this is something that is in our toolbox, they're going to start building counters. At least the near peers are. So APS can't be treated as a standalone. It must sit inside of a full architecture package. A paraglider alone, it's very fragile, but a paraglider inside a well-planned reconnaissance operation, I think it's useful. Not a replacement for helicopters or boats or traditional parachutes or submarines or other things, but a very narrow tool for a very narrow window. Yeah, I dig it, man. Narrow tools win wars. Yeah. So I think it definitely answers a question about how do you get a small team into contested littoral without lighting up the whole board. I think the Marine Corps is answering. And yeah, we're going to keep tracking it. We're going to keep our eye on it. I definitely want to make some phone calls and see where this is at the program level. Maybe I will get the chance to go out and at least watch one fly around. I think it would be interesting. I I would also be interested to see if it is going to stay limited to recon or MARSOC, or if it is going to find its way into other units. That would be interesting. How is it going to integrate with electronic warfare and counter drone and sensors? I would also be interested to see if it becomes a serious doctrine-backed capability, or if it's just going to be stuck on a shelf as a demonstration tool. Oh, and mishaps. They're going to shape the program too. All it takes is 1 or 2 fatalities, and I would definitely see this as put away. Not in the same way that parachute fatalities put it away, but there's always a very deep dive when there is a fatality in any training pipeline or any apparatus. This one would be no different. Yeah. So that is, I think, it for this evening. I wanted to say thank you again for all the people that have supported us. And to those of you that are tiered, we have packages going out regularly. So if you have not received a sticker, t-shirt, or a signed art print, don't worry, it is in the way. In the way? No, it is on the way. We do have new stickers coming. We do have new t-shirts coming. And we are continuing to send out autographed prints to our top tier members. So I want to say thank you once again for everybody. And if you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a concern, please feel free to email the show, contact@bradcolbert.us, contact@bradcolbert.us. We answer every email, regardless of how hyperbolic it may be, how inflammatory it may be. No matter what the question is, we do our level best to answer it. And if you're following along on the socials, we also patrol those pretty regularly. And I will answer everything that gets out there that is worthy of a response will get a response. So don't be shy. I look forward to carrying on the discussion next week. I am Brad Colbert, the Iceman, and always reminding all of you to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.